When I woke up, the first thing I noticed was the stark, blinding light overhead. I blinked several times, trying to adjust my eyes to the harsh fluorescent glow. The light flickered intermittently, casting eerie shadows that danced on the walls. As my vision cleared, I realized I was in a hospital bed, but the room was eerily silent and devoid of any other presence. I sat up slowly, my head throbbing with a dull ache. The room was cold, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and makes you shiver uncontrollably. I looked around, trying to make sense of my surroundings. The walls were a sterile white, the paint peeling in some places. Medical equipment stood silent and still, their displays dark. A sense of unease settled over me as I swung my legs over the side of the bed and stood up. My feet were bare, and the tile floor was icy against my skin. I took a deep breath and stepped towards the door, my footsteps echoing in the empty room. The hallway outside was just as deserted. The lights flickered sporadically, casting long, eerie shadows that seemed to move on their own. I called out, hoping for a response, but my voice echoed back to me, the only reply in the oppressive silence. I began to walk down the hallway, my heart pounding with each step. Every door I passed was closed, and when I tried the handles, they were all locked. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional flicker and buzz of the overhead lights. As I made my way through the labyrinthine corridors, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I glanced over my shoulder several times, but the hallway remained empty. I turned a corner and found myself in front of the nurse's station. The desk was cluttered with papers and medical supplies, but there was no sign of anyone. I picked up a phone on the desk and pressed it to my ear, but there was no dial tone, just an ominous silence. I slammed it down, frustration and fear mounting within me. I needed to find someone, anyone, who could tell me what was happening. I continued down the hall, my steps quickening. The oppressive silence was broken by a distant sound, a faint, rhythmic beeping. I followed it, the sound growing louder and more distinct with each step. It led me to a set of double doors, slightly ajar. I pushed them open and stepped inside. The room beyond was a large ward, filled with rows of empty beds. The beeping was coming from a heart monitor attached to the only occupied bed in the room. I approached cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. Lying in the bed was a woman, her face pale and gaunt. Her eyes were closed and she looked almost peaceful, except for the deep, angry gash on her forehead. The heart monitor beeped steadily, but the line on the screen was flat, indicating no heartbeat. I stared in horror, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. How could the monitor be beeping if the woman was dead? I backed away slowly, my mind racing. The lights flickered again, and the room seemed to grow colder. I turned to leave, but the double doors slammed shut with a deafening bang. I rushed to the doors and tried to open them, but they wouldn't budge. Panic surged through me as I pounded on the doors, shouting for help. The lights flickered once more, and the beeping from the heart monitor stopped abruptly. I turned back to the woman in the bed, and my blood ran cold. Her eyes were open, staring directly at me, and her mouth was twisted into a grotesque smile. I stumbled back, my heart racing. The woman's eyes followed me, and I could hear a faint whispering sound, like a dozen voices speaking at once. The temperature in the room plummeted, and my breath came out in visible puffs. I turned back to the doors, desperate to escape. My hands shook as I fumbled with the handle, but it remained stubbornly locked. The whispering grew louder, and I could feel a presence behind me, something cold and dark. I spun around, pressing my back against the door. The woman in the bed was sitting up now, her eyes fixed on me. The whispering voices seemed to emanate from her, filling the room with a sense of dread. I had to get out of there, but there was nowhere to go. Suddenly, the lights went out completely, plunging the room into darkness. The whispering stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence. I felt a cold hand grip my shoulder, and I screamed, thrashing against the door. The lights flickered back on, and the woman was standing right in front of me, her face inches from mine. Her eyes were empty, hollow pits, and her breath was like a cold wind against my skin. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, her voice a chilling echo. I pushed past her, my fear giving me strength. The doors finally gave way, and I stumbled into the hallway, my heart pounding. I ran, not caring where I was going, just needing to get away. The hallways twisted and turned, the flickering lights casting eerie shadows. I could hear footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate, keeping pace with my frantic run. I didn't dare look back. I rounded a corner and skidded to a halt. In front of me was another set of double doors, but these were open, leading into a stairwell. I took the stairs two at a time, the sound of footsteps growing louder behind me. I burst through a door at the bottom of the stairs and found myself in the basement. The air was damp and musty, and the lights were dim and flickering. I could hear the hum of machinery, but the place seemed deserted. I ran down the corridor, my footsteps echoing off the concrete walls. I passed storage rooms and maintenance closets, all empty. The sense of being watched was overwhelming, and I knew I wasn't alone. I turned a corner and came face to face with a figure in a dark hooded cloak. Their face was hidden in shadow, but I could feel their eyes on me. I backed away slowly, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The figure stepped forward and I turned to run, but the corridor behind me was blocked by another figure. They advanced slowly, and I was trapped between them. I pressed my back against the wall, my heart racing. The figures closed in, their presence suffocating. The lights flickered and went out, plunging the basement into darkness. I felt cold hands grab my arms, and I screamed, struggling against their grip. The whispering voices filled my ears, and I could feel the darkness closing in around me. When the lights flickered back on, I was alone. The figures were gone, but their presence lingered, a cold, oppressive weight on my chest. I stumbled down the corridor, desperate to find a way out. At the end of the hallway, I found a door marked Exit. I pushed it open and stepped into the cold night air, my breath coming in visible puffs. I was outside, but the sense of dread remained. I looked back at the hospital, its windows dark and empty. The flickering lights cast eerie shadows, and I knew I would never be free of what I had seen. I walked away, my mind numb with fear. The hospital had changed me, and I knew I would never be the same. The darkness had followed me, and there was no escape. The whispers still echoed in my mind, a haunting reminder of the terror that awaited within those walls. The basement had always been a place of mystery in my old family home. It was a large, musty space filled with the accumulated belongings of several generations, a labyrinth of boxes and forgotten relics. I had spent countless hours down there as a child, exploring and imagining what secrets might be hidden away. But now, as an adult, the basement seemed more foreboding than fascinating. One stormy evening, when the power went out, I decided to finally tackle the job of cleaning it up. Armed with a flashlight and a determination to make some sense of the chaos, I descended the creaky wooden stairs into the gloom. The beam of my flashlight cut through the dust-laden air, revealing stacks of old furniture, trunks, and shelves lined with jars of preserved foods long past their prime. As I began sorting through the boxes, I came across a small, leather-bound diary, its cover worn and cracked with age. It had a lock, but the clasp was broken, allowing the book to open easily. Intrigued, I sat down on an old wooden crate and began to read. The diary belonged to a girl named Eliza, who had lived in the house over a century ago. Her handwriting was elegant, and her entries were filled with the details of her daily life, her hopes, and her fears. The more I read, the more engrossed I became. Eliza wrote about her strict parents, her longing for freedom, and the strange occurrences that began to plague the house. As I turned the pages, the entries grew darker. Eliza wrote about hearing whispers at night, about doors slamming shut on their own, and about the feeling of being watched. Her fear was palpable, and I could almost feel her desperation seeping through the pages. One entry in particular caught my attention. It was dated October 13, 1912. The whispers are getting louder. Last night, I woke to the sound of my bedroom door slamming shut. When I got up to investigate, I found the basement door open, a cold draft blowing up from below. I know something is down there, something that wants to be found, but I am too afraid to go. A chill ran down my spine as I read her words. The basement door had been open when I came down tonight, too. I dismissed the thought as a coincidence and continued reading, but the unease lingered. Hours passed, and I lost track of time. The storm raged on outside, and the basement seemed to grow colder with each passing minute. I was deep into the diary when I heard it, the sound of a door slamming shut. The noise echoed through the basement, making me jump. I stood up, my heart pounding, and shone my flashlight around the room. Everything seemed in place, but the sense of being watched was overwhelming. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was not alone. Deciding I had done enough for one night, I placed the diary on a nearby shelf and made my way back upstairs. As I reached the top of the stairs, the basement door slammed shut behind me with a force that rattled the walls. I spun around, but there was no one there. My hands trembled as I turned the knob, but the door was stuck fast. Panic set in, and I pounded on the door, shouting for help. The house was silent except for the storm outside. I took a deep breath and forced myself to calm down. After a few minutes of struggling, I managed to wrench the door open. I hurried to my bedroom, locking the door behind me. Exhausted and unnerved, I eventually fell into a restless sleep. The next few days were uneventful, but I couldn't stop thinking about Eliza's diary and the strange occurrences in the basement. One night, as I was lying in bed, I heard the unmistakable sound of the basement door creaking open. My blood ran cold, and I listened intently. The house was silent, but the feeling of being watched returned, stronger than ever. Gathering my courage, I grabbed my flashlight and made my way downstairs. The basement door was ajar, just as I had feared. I pushed it open and descended the stairs, the beam of my flashlight slicing through the darkness. The diary was still on the shelf where I had left it. I picked it up and continued reading, hoping to find some answers. Eliza's final entries were frantic, filled with terror and confusion. She wrote about waking up to find herself standing at the basement door, about hearing her name whispered in the dead of night. Her last entry was dated November 1st, 1912. I can no longer tell what is real and what is a dream. The whispers are constant, and the doors slam shut of their own accord. I fear I am losing my mind. I do not know what it wants from me, but I am too afraid to find out. The entry ended abruptly, the final words scrawled hastily across the page. As I read, a cold draft swept through the basement, extinguishing my flashlight. I was plunged into darkness, and the sense of being watched intensified. I fumbled with the flashlight, my hands shaking, but it wouldn't turn back on. I felt a presence behind me, cold and oppressive. My breath came in short, panicked gasps as I backed towards the stairs. Suddenly, the basement door slammed shut again, trapping me in the darkness. I pounded on the door, shouting for help, but my cries were swallowed by the darkness. The whispers began, soft at first, then growing louder, surrounding me. I could feel something closing in, a cold hand brushing against my arm. I screamed and scrambled up the stairs, throwing myself against the door. It flew open, and I stumbled into the hallway, slamming it shut behind me. I didn't sleep that night. The whispers continued, just beyond the door, a constant reminder of the darkness that lurked below. I knew I had to get out of the house, to leave and never return. But as I packed my bags, I found the diary on my bed, open to a blank page. A single sentence was written in the same elegant handwriting: "You cannot escape." The door to my bedroom slammed shut, and the whispers filled the room. I realized then that the darkness had followed me, that there was no escape from the terror that had claimed Eliza and now sought to claim me. As the whispers grew louder, I knew that I was not alone, and that the horror of the basement had only just begun. The doors slammed shut, trapping me in the darkness, and the whispers promised that I would never leave. It was supposed to be a perfect weekend getaway. My friends and I had planned the camping trip for months, eagerly anticipating the chance to escape the city and immerse ourselves in nature. We chose a secluded spot in the forest, far from any trails or other campers. The idea was to be completely alone, surrounded by nothing but trees and the sounds of the wilderness. There were 5 of us: Mark, the fearless leader of our group; Lisa, his girlfriend, who was always up for an adventure; Chris, the jokester who kept us all laughing; Sarah, the quiet one who loved nature; and me, the planner who made sure we had everything we needed. We arrived at the campsite late in the afternoon, the sun beginning its descent behind the trees. The air was crisp and cool, filled with the earthy scent of pine and damp leaves. We set up our tents in a small clearing, gathered wood for a fire, and settled in for the night. As darkness fell, we sat around the campfire, roasting marshmallows and sharing stories. The fire crackled and popped, casting flickering shadows that danced among the trees. It felt like we were in our own little world, far from the stresses of everyday life. Around midnight, we decided to call it a night. One by one, we retreated to our tents, the fire reduced to glowing embers. The forest was silent, except for the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant call of an owl. I fell asleep quickly, the sound of the forest lulling me into a deep slumber. I woke suddenly in the middle of the night, my heart pounding. Something had jolted me awake, but I wasn't sure what. I lay still, listening intently. The forest was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that felt unnatural. I unzipped my tent and peered out into the darkness. The moonlight cast a pale glow over the campsite, but everything seemed in order. I was about to crawl back into my tent when I noticed that Mark's tent was open, the flap fluttering slightly in the breeze. I called out his name softly, but there was no response. Concerned, I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out into the clearing. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but there was no sign of Mark. I woke Chris and Sarah, explaining that Mark was missing. Together, we searched the surrounding area, our calls echoing through the trees. Lisa woke up too and joined us, her face pale with worry. But there was no sign of Mark. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. We huddled together, trying to make sense of what had happened. Mark was an experienced camper. He wouldn't have wandered off without telling anyone. We decided to wait until morning before panicking, hoping that he would return on his own. As the first light of dawn broke through the trees, we resumed our search. The forest seemed different in the daylight, less menacing, but still filled with an uneasy sense of foreboding. We scoured the area for hours, but there was no trace of Mark. By afternoon, we were exhausted and scared. We returned to the campsite, hoping to regroup and come up with a plan. But when we arrived, we found that Lisa was gone too. Her tent was open, her belongings scattered, as if she had left in a hurry. Panic set in. Two of our friends had disappeared without a trace, and we had no idea what was happening. Chris suggested we pack up and leave immediately, but Sarah insisted we stay and search for them. Reluctantly, we agreed to stay one more night, but we decided to keep watch in shifts. That night, the atmosphere was tense. The fire burned low, and every rustle of leaves sent us into high alert. Chris took the first watch while Sarah and I tried to get some sleep. But sleep was elusive, my mind racing with fear and uncertainty. I must have dozed off at some point because I woke to the sound of Chris shouting. I scrambled out of my tent, heart pounding. Chris was standing at the edge of the clearing, flashlight beam darting through the trees. "Sarah's gone!" he shouted, his voice tinged with panic. I rushed to Sarah's tent, finding it empty. Just like Mark and Lisa, she had vanished without a trace. Chris and I stood there, fear gripping us. We were alone in the middle of the forest, with no idea what was happening to our friends. "We need to leave," Chris said, his voice trembling. "We can't stay here." I agreed. We quickly packed up our gear, our movements frantic and hurried. As we worked, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that something was lurking just beyond the circle of light from our fire. With our packs on our backs, we set off into the forest, following the path that had brought us here. The darkness seemed to close in around us, the trees pressing in from all sides. The flashlight beams cut through the blackness, but it felt like we were walking into a void. We hadn't gone far when we heard it, a soft, whispering sound, like voices carried on the wind. We stopped, straining to listen. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and I realized they were coming from all around us. Panic surged through me. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing Chris's arm. We sprinted through the forest, branches whipping at our faces, the whispers following us. The path seemed to twist and turn, leading us deeper into the darkness. I glanced over my shoulder, but Chris was no longer behind me. I stopped, calling his name, but there was no answer. I was alone. My friends had all disappeared, and now I was lost in the forest, the whispers growing louder, more menacing. I stumbled forward, tears streaming down my face, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Finally, I broke through the trees and into a small clearing. In the center stood an old, dilapidated cabin, its windows dark and foreboding. I hesitated, but the whispers were closing in, and I had nowhere else to go. I pushed open the door and stepped inside, the floorboards creaking under my weight. The cabin was empty, save for a few pieces of broken furniture and a cold, damp chill that seeped into my bones. As I stood there, trying to catch my breath, I heard a soft, familiar voice. "Help me." I turned, my heart leaping into my throat. It was Sarah, standing in the doorway, her eyes wide with fear. She beckoned to me, her voice trembling. "Please, help me." I rushed to her, relief flooding through me. But as I reached out to touch her, she vanished, her form dissolving into the darkness. I stumbled back, my mind reeling. The whispers grew louder, filling the cabin with their insidious presence. I realized then that I was trapped. There was no escape from the forest, no way to save my friends. The darkness had claimed them, and now it was coming for me. The last thing I heard before the darkness swallowed me was the sound of the whispers, cold and unforgiving, promising that I would never leave. And then, there was only silence. The fog was so thick that night, it felt like driving through a cloud. My headlights barely cut through the dense, swirling mist, illuminating only a few feet ahead of me. The road was deserted, and an eerie silence hung in the air, broken only by the soft hum of my car's engine. I was returning from a late business meeting in a town I rarely visited. The unfamiliar roads twisted and turned through dense woods, and the fog made everything look the same. Every tree, every curve in the road seemed to blend into one continuous, disorienting landscape. I could feel the tension in my shoulders as I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white. I was just starting to wonder if I had taken a wrong turn when I saw something up ahead. A small figure standing by the side of the road, barely visible through the fog. As I drew closer, my heart began to race. It was a child, a young girl, standing alone in the middle of nowhere. I pulled over and rolled down the window, the cold, damp air rushing into the car. "Hey there," I called out. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" The girl didn't respond. She just stood there staring at me with wide, frightened eyes. She couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 years old, her clothes thin and worn. I felt a pang of concern. What was she doing out here all alone in this weather? I opened the door and stepped out, my breath forming clouds in the chilly air. "It's not safe out here," I said gently. "Why don't you come with me? I'll take you somewhere safe." The girl hesitated for a moment, then nodded slowly. She climbed into the passenger seat, and I closed the door behind her. As I got back into the driver's seat, I noticed she was shivering. I turned up the heat and offered her my jacket, which she accepted with a shy nod. "What's your name?" I asked as I pulled back onto the road, driving slowly through the fog. She replied in a small voice, "Nice to meet you, Emily. My name's John. Do you know where your parents are?" She shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. "I don't know. I got lost." I felt a surge of protectiveness. "Don't worry, Emily. We'll find them. I'll take you to the nearest town, and we'll call for help." As we drove, I tried to make conversation to keep her calm, but she remained quiet, staring out the window into the fog. I kept glancing at her, feeling an unease that I couldn't quite place. There was something about her silence, the way she clutched my jacket tightly around her, that sent chills down my spine. After what felt like hours, we reached a small town. The streets were empty, the shops closed, and the fog still hung heavy in the air. I pulled into a gas station, relieved to see it was open. I parked the car and turned to Emily. "Stay here, okay? I'm gonna go inside and get some help." She nodded, her eyes wide with fear. I stepped out of the car and walked into the gas station, the bell above the door jingling as I entered. The clerk looked up from his magazine, his expression bored. "Can I help you?" he asked. "Yeah, I found this girl on the side of the road," I said, pointing to my car. "She's lost and needs help finding her parents. Can you call the police or something?" The clerk's eyes widened and he stood up, glancing out the window. "What girl?" I turned to look and my heart nearly stopped. The passenger seat was empty. Emily was gone. I rushed back outside, my mind racing. The fog had thickened even more, making it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. "Emily!" I called out, my voice echoing in the silence. "Emily, where are you?" There was no response, only the oppressive stillness of the fog. Panic set in, and I began to search the area, calling her name. I checked behind the gas station, in the nearby alleyways, but she was nowhere to be found. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. I returned to the gas station, my heart pounding. The clerk looked at me with a mix of confusion and concern. "Are you sure you had a girl with you?" he asked. "Yes, she was right here," I insisted, feeling the frustration and fear rising. "Her name was Emily. She said she was lost." The clerk shook his head. "I didn't see anyone, man. Maybe you should sit down for a bit. You look like you've seen a ghost." I sank into a chair, my mind reeling. Had I imagined it? No, that was impossible. I had seen her, talked to her. She had been real. As I sat there trying to make sense of what had happened, an old man entered the gas station. He glanced at me, then did a double take. His face went pale, and he hurried over. "Did you say you found a girl named Emily?" he asked, his voice trembling. "Yes," I replied, "but she disappeared. Do you know her?" The old man nodded, his eyes wide with fear. "Emily Harper. She went missing 10 years ago, right around this time of year. They never found her." My blood ran cold. "But I just saw her. She was right here." The old man shook his head. "Many people have seen her, always on nights like this when the fog is thick. They say she's still looking for her parents, still lost." I felt a chill run down my spine. Had I really seen a ghost? It seemed impossible, but the fear and confusion in the old man's eyes told me otherwise. I thanked the clerk and the old man and left the gas station, my mind racing. As I drove away, the fog began to lift, revealing the dark, empty road ahead. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been part of something beyond my understanding, something that defied explanation. The rest of the drive home was a blur. When I finally reached my house, I was exhausted and shaken. I parked the car and sat there for a moment, trying to process what had happened. As I stepped out of the car, I glanced at the passenger seat and saw my jacket lying there, neatly folded. On top of it was a small, worn-out doll, the kind a young girl might cherish. I picked it up, my hands trembling. The air grew cold, and the fog began to swirl around me again. I looked up and saw Emily standing at the end of my driveway, her eyes sad and filled with longing. She raised her hand as if to wave, then slowly faded into the mist. I stood there, clutching the doll, my heart heavy with sorrow. Emily was gone, but her presence lingered, a haunting reminder of the girl who was forever lost in the fog. And I knew, deep down, that I would never forget her, nor the night I met the ghost of Emily Harper.